My name is Kyle Sebastian, and I am the Higher Education Programming Coordinator at the JED Foundation. And JED is a nonprofit that protects emotional health and prevents suicide for our nation's teens and young adults. Through our signature program, JED Campus, we partner with over 300 colleges and universities across the United States to guide them in a 4-year collaborative process of comprehensive systems, program, and policy development that builds upon existing student mental health, substance use, and suicide prevention efforts on campus. In today's webinar, we will be discussing how college and university campuses can utilize an equity-minded framework and public health approach to develop spaces on campus that promote emotional health and well-being. Before we introduce today's speakers, our agenda, and the learning outcomes for today's attendees, I'd like to share our usual housekeeping items. 1, if you need closed captioning services at any point during today's presentation, please use the link that was provided in the welcome message as you logged on to GoToWebinar. This will open up a second window on your computer where you can follow a live transcription of today's presentation. 2, if at any point you have a question for our presenters, please type it into the question box on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will answer it during our live Q&A at the end of the presentation. 3, you can find a PDF copy of today's slides in the handout section of the GoToWebinar dashboard. If you do not choose to download the slides during the webinar, or you are eventually listening to a recording of this, you can simply ask for a copy of the slides by emailing me at Kyle, K-Y-L-E, @jedfoundation.org. And finally, to that end, today's webinar will be recorded for future access via JED's online mental health resource center. So we want to go ahead and begin by introducing our presenters, and we'll start with Dr. Sofia Pertuz. Sofia is JED's Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer and Senior Advisor for JED Campus. Sofia joined JED in November 2018 with over 20 years of experience in strategic planning, assessment, inclusive excellence, and critical incident management in higher education. She most recently served as Associate Vice President and Dean of Students at Hofstra University and Assistant Dean and Director for Multicultural Affairs at Fordham University. Sofia has been an invited speaker to international audiences on topics in leadership, change management, social justice, and LGBTQ advocacy, including delivering keynotes in Spanish. Sofia is the author of a book chapter exploring Latinx identity, cultural values, and success in higher education, and her research focuses on Latinx leadership and culturally responsive mental health resources. Sofia dedicates volunteer time sharing knowledge and skills through mentorship and organizational activities, aiming to create inclusive and caring communities. Sofia completed a BA degree in organizational communication from SUNY New Paltz and earned her MA and PhD in higher education leadership management and policy, both from Seton Hall University. And with all of that information, I am going to go ahead and pass it off to Sofia to introduce the rest of our speakers and kick off today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Kyle. So we're very excited about today's presentation, and we'll share more of our learning outcomes and information in a bit. But I want to introduce you to our 2 presenters for today. First, we have Andre Banerjee. Andre is currently a landscape designer in Columbus, Ohio, and has worked on various residential and commercial projects. During his undergraduate studies at The Ohio State University, he developed a passion for mental health advocacy and formed and led the Active Minds chapter at OSU, a student organization that aims to combat stigma and surrounding mental illnesses. In 2018, Andre was chosen as a fellow for the Active Minds Emerging Scholars Fellowship, which supported and funded college students to research a topic surrounding the behavioral health of college-age students. For the fellowship, Andre studied how the outdoor built environment on university campuses can be designed to address the rising needs of college students and mental health concerns. Post-graduation, Andre is advancing into the field of landscape architecture and hopes to continue and apply his research directly into his work. Andre's goal is to design landscapes that benefit not only college students psychologically, but in all aspects of campus life. And his pronouns are he, him, his. And earlier, I forgot to say my pronouns are she, her, hers. We also have Dr. David Jones here. Dr. Jones is the Chief Diversity Officer and Director of Talent Management at Paterson University, regularly invited to colleges and universities to serve as diversity consultant, speaker, and trainer. Dr. Jones's career includes previously serving in higher education leadership roles for cultural centers and multicultural affairs departments, such as the Paul Robeson Cultural Center at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, one of the first cultural centers founded on a college campus. Dr. Jones has maintained an active leadership agenda with the National Association for Student Personnel Administrators, NASPA, where he currently serves as a leadership team member for the African American Male Summit and co-founder and co-director of the 2019 Ujima Institute. His diversity work in higher education is highly regarded, and as a result, he has been the recipient of awards such as Social Justice Educator Award for ACPA's Commission for Social Justice Educators and NASPA Region 1's Network for Educational Equity and Ethnic Diversity Award. David holds a doctorate in education, in leadership, organizational leadership, and communication from Northeastern University, a Master of Education in College Student Affairs from the University of South Florida, and the Bachelor of Science in Communications from Eastern Connecticut State University. His pronouns are he, him, his. So we want to thank both our presenters today. We're going to share a little bit about our agenda, just so that everyone knows what we're trying to cover in this 1 hour. And one thing I want to say is I want to make sure that everyone can participate. So we have the chat feature. We also have the phone call. We can have people unmuted if you need to. So just let us know and we'll be happy to have you ask any questions. If we can get to the next slide. We're going to we already introduced everyone, so we're already there. I'm going to have a brief discussion on the idea of safe spaces and what brought us to this topic. Then we're going to interview Andre and interview Dr. Jones. Right after that, we're going to have a Q&A with audience participation. Again, please feel free to share your questions via our chat feature or chime in and let us know by raising your hand in the app to let us know that you would like to ask a question. So for our learning outcomes on the next slide, we just basically already talked about the idea of safe spaces and what that means on college campuses. We also want to learn about the idea of physical and emotional well-being of college students and what space means for that. Then the final thing we want to cover is the idea of safety in general and what we put this in quotes on purpose. Safe spaces specifically means for underrepresented and minoritized college student populations. I know that these are some basic concepts, but actually not as basic as we think when we're trying to look at it from different angles, whether it's physical space, emotional space, and anything in between. So we thought it was important to bring these two elements together, and that's why we chose our speakers for today, to look at it from different angles. So we appreciate both their participation. So I'll start with some thoughts on just what are safe spaces, and I was able to find this exact description that looks at it from different perspectives. I know that it has been sometimes a controversial term. So safe spaces and trigger warnings, that idea of trigger warnings. This is not a webinar about trigger warnings, but I think that those two concepts have actually been linked together and have been a subject of much controversy on college campuses. So proponents say safe spaces are necessary to provide support and understanding to historically marginalized groups. Opponents say safe spaces hinder intellectual thought. Amid all the discussion of whether there is a place for safe spaces on college campuses, there has been little conversation about what safe spaces actually are. So these are some open-ended questions that I thought would be great for us to start the conversation. Is a safe space just a physical location on campus, or is it a mental state? What groups should have access to safe spaces? Does the school have a responsibility to provide these spaces? In the end, safe spaces on college campuses are part of a larger conversation about empathy, power dynamics, and intersectional identities. And I can't agree with this concept more. And I think it does become challenging when we have different thought processes about what is safe space and do we need to prepare folks for what they're getting into when it comes to learning and trying to honor the idea of free speech. We also are not going to cover free speech in this webinar, but we do believe that it's completely related. And I'll give you an example of how this plays out. A couple of years ago, I served on a panel with some editorial cartoonists, which was an amazing opportunity. The topic was free speech in the era of Trump, social media, and safe spaces. And it was the Association of American Editorial Cartoonists, the annual convention. And on this panel, I got the privilege to serve with two very well-known cartoonists, And one of them had brought up the idea of how far do we go with trying to protect everyone and trying to create warnings for the content that students, college students are going to receive. And, I was there too, as the dean of students at the time. I was at Hofstra at the time, and it was taking place at Hofstra University. I had the chance to say, basically, safe space means that students can find like-minded folks to have conversations. That doesn't mean that they're going to not learn from other sides and other opinions, but we wanted to create some spaces where people could just speak freely, explore their own topics without being attacked for their status or opinions, or to be hit with uninformed and offensive opinions. We know that sometimes in the classroom, there are the idea is to encourage a lot of different conversations and create spaces where students will engage and truly have learning happen. And that can only happen with freedom of speech and people being able to share freely. However, we also feel there should be some spaces where there is safety and that people can explore their identities without feeling persecuted or discriminated against. And even on that panel, I bring up the panel because I thought it was an interesting moment where we one cartoonist said, "Well, we don't need all that," and I said, "Okay, I respect that opinion." But then later on in the conversation, I think there was some kind of protest happening, and there was a time when that person was going to do a speech, and they didn't realize that their information was not either being published or it was being protested against, and basically said, I should have been warned, or someone should have told me that I was walking into that contentious situation. And I turned and said, oh, so you wanted a safe space for you to be able to engage in that space. So I share that to say that even when you do have strong opinions about what safe space means, it really is very personal and very specific to each person's situation and what they're willing and able to share, depending on where they are and where their location is. So on the next slide, this is from a survey that the JED Foundation and the C Fund collaborated with, a Nielsen survey of 1,000 college students. And the reason why I'm showing this slide is because we did find that college students of color rated their experiences less favorably than the way that white students were describing it. Ratings for the overall college campus experience, climate, and safety were rated lower by students of color as compared to white students. There's a lot more data than we have to share in this webinar, but one other point that is important to note is that students of color are less likely to seek help and receive treatment for mental health conditions. So we know that it's important to create spaces where students can be safe to reach out to those that they trust, and that trust cannot happen in a space that is not safe. And so it makes sense that if the college experience is not a positive one, that mistrust may be connected to whether or not students reach out for help. The next slide shows just a couple of examples of moments when, these two stories highlight the juxtaposition of how physical space and presence might interact with feelings of emotional safety when students want to just be themselves and navigate their campuses without fear of discrimination or oppression. The first story is from a couple of years ago when a Black graduate student at Yale was napping, and a white student who was not familiar with them or didn't know them called the police, not knowing if that person was supposed to be there. Later that same year, a similar incident happened at Smith College when an employee called campus police about a student that was having a meal in the dining hall. Those moments are disconcerting because it lends itself to the idea of who owns which space and who looks like they should be in any space. And then the second story on the right is about LGBTQ students at Brigham Young University. This is as new as today, who are wondering if they can be their full selves when they're on campus. And that is beyond the idea of physical space, but it is both emotional and physical, depending on where you're located and what the situation is. So I'll stop there with regard to speaking on the idea of safe spaces, as I do want to turn it over to our first guest today, Andre Banerjee. So Andre, my question for you is, when it comes to the idea of safe spaces, and I'm putting that in quotes again, how would you describe this concept and the connection to landscape design and outdoor space?
Hi, Sophia. First, thank you for the information before, and thank you for posing that question. For me, I believe that the idea of a safe space is both a physical place and a mental state of mind where one feels comfortable expressing their thoughts and emotions in a setting that allows them to have the time and place to directly voice their opinions. But I also think that it can be a social or a personal experience. And I believe that the biggest role of a safe space is easing feelings of anxiety and promoting a sense of healing. And so I want to dive deeper into the connection to landscape design as you had asked. But I just want to take a quick minute and provide some more background into the presentation. So as mentioned earlier, during my undergraduate career, I was an advocate for mental health and was chosen to pursue a funded behavioral health research project through the Active Minds Emerging Scholars Fellowship. And so for my project, I studied how university campuses can be designed to address the mental health needs of students. The project was heavily literature-based, and I reviewed many medical and landscape journals, as well as interviewing students and visiting campuses. And so today I'll be giving a brief overview of how my research translates into the design of safe spaces on university campuses, and furthermore, hopefully start the conversation of what a safe space looks like for each of you. So this is kind of a recap of some of the things that were mentioned earlier, but safe spaces have recently become more prevalent across many different social settings and are especially prevalent in the context of university campuses. And so I believe that these spaces take on two forms, the social and the physical. On the social side, a safe space is typically thought of as a group of people who are engaged in a discussion without any tolerance of violence, judgment, or harassment. Those who are in the safe space are encouraged to express themselves with the hope that they do not feel discriminated against based on any part of their identity. And at the beginning of the conversation, there is usually an announcement by the facilitator where they explain the rules of the safe space and how it is a judgment-free zone. And this is not always the case, but more often than not, this is how it is viewed. And this is arguably the more popular and recognized version of what a safe space is. In the context of university campuses, an example of this would be a group of students discussing how a recent shooting on campus has affected them with a professor and creating a plan of action in case it were to ever happen again. And so moving on, safe spaces can also be thought of in a physical form. They can be places indoors or outdoors where people feel protected. In the context of university campuses, these spaces would ideally be places where students, faculty, and staff feel at peace and protected against threats to their own physical safety or comfort. And this is arguably the less recognized form of a safe space, in my opinion, because we often don't take the time to consciously consider if every place that we travel to or through is safe. It is more of a subconscious judgment. So an example of a safe space on a university campus could be a student's residence hall because it is a locked and guarded building with high security and safety protocols. And so the two forms of safe spaces, social and physical, exist both independently and also exist together. People can engage in a judgment-free discussion in a physical setting that is calming and protected against outside threats. The social and physical form work together, ensuring that those who are inhabiting them feel comfortable, safe, and secure. For the purposes of this segment of the webinar, I will be going into more depth about outdoor safe spaces on college campuses. So based on my previous research, I propose that university students, faculty, and staff are more likely to deem an outdoor space on campus as a safe space based on the prevalence of the following 5 elements: vegetation, so plants, water, structures, lighting, and seating. I will touch the surface of some of the theories that explain the importance of these elements and how they can apply to the campus outdoor environment. So we'll start with vegetation and water. Professor and researcher Roger Ulrich proposed the stress recovery theory in 1991 that explains the restorative effects of nature on humans. This theory claims that when in natural settings rather than urban settings, humans will experience more recovery from strain and stress by easing their attention, emotions, and physiology. From studies that he conducted in the 90s, which included exposing subjects to different natural views, his data concluded that natural settings had positive effects on muscle tension, heart rate, skin conductance, and systolic blood pressure. Additionally, his studies helped further the hypothesis that viewing natural settings had an increased positive effect on the parasympathetic nervous system that is associated with involuntary action and response, a key indicator of relieving stress. So, in essence, plants are good for you. Based on his findings, I predict that spaces in the campus outdoor landscape that have more natural elements such as vegetation and water will also have the same positive effects on students, faculty, and staff. The next category is structures and lighting. Prospect refuge theory was proposed by geographer and landscape researcher J. Appleton in 1975. His theory states that humans prefer to experience the landscape so that they can see without being seen, and within that prefer to have an expansive view that allows them to see potential threats. Expanding on this theory, researchers Claire Cooper Marcus and Naomi Sachs comment on the contemporary human experience in relation to this theory, stating that humans intuitively avoid environments, things, and situations that appear to threaten survival. And thus, the ability to see with a clear view from a safe vantage point without being seen and without potential danger is most comfortable and thus most preferred. Humans are more likely to experience less levels of anxiety in spaces where there is an open field of vision to see potential offenders, the lack of hiding places for offenders to remain hidden from potential victims, and easy means of escape for a potential victim in any space. And one way that I like to think about this theory in just kind of a more laid-back way is, once you ever play hide and seek, when you're seeking out a space, you want to be in a place where you can see everybody around you, but you're hidden from the outside view of anybody else. So that might help, put the theory in context a little bit. And so going back to campus design, I predict that campus designers can take this theory and apply it to the design of spaces on campus. I predict that ample lighting and structures such as covered walkways, gates, and gazebos will provide a sense of protection. With sufficient lighting, spaces will offer clear sight lines and be perceived as less dangerous and safer. Structures such as covered walkways, gates, and gazebos provide not only protection from natural elements such as rain and snow, but also can be designed to allow for easy entry and exit, as to avoid feelings of entrapment for those who enter them. So the last category is seating. Attention restoration theory was proposed by researchers Stephen and Rachel Kaplan in the 1980s. This theory explains how our attention functions in the context of outdoor spaces. They propose that humans have two types of attention, directed and involuntary. Our directed attention is what we use when we need to complete a task, usually of high difficulty, and requires us to be focused and concentrated. For example, studying for a test. Our involuntary attention is what we use when presented with stimuli that require little to no effort and are normally brought on unintentionally by external sources, such as watching clouds or birds in the sky. However, our directed attention is limited and needs to be replenished. Researchers Matthew Andrews and Birgitta Gedersleben explain that our directed attention is best recharged through exposure to a source of involuntary attention. Natural settings are believed to be of particular value for directed attention restoration. Similarly, environments that are easily readable and accessible are more restorative because they require less directed attention to maneuver through and experience. Outdoor spaces that have many components and places for elements to be hidden and require a lot of focus in order to be navigated cause strain on our directed attention and can evoke anxiety and stress. So based on this theory, I hypothesize that campus landscapes that have plenty of seating that is facing towards natural elements such as vegetation and water will allow for the user to relax and shift their directed attention to involuntary attention and help relieve feelings of anxiety. Additionally, seating can be designed to anticipate individual, one-on-one, or group interactions. And based on the needs of students, if there are areas on campus that are smaller and are seen to be more solitary places, individual benches might be an ideal option. And also, in places that are on campus that are larger or have the potential to host groups of people, or even hold a safe space conversation, then larger, more flexible seating, such as movable tables and chairs, are a more viable option. So just to recap, as we have gone over some of the elements that I propose to be crucial components of a safe outdoor space on campus, I will address here that this is certainly not a definitive list, and this is solely based on literature and different theories that have been proposed over time. So therefore, I invite you all to think about an outdoor space on campus, or just any place in general that you feel safe in, whether it's somewhere you work or live, or even someplace you just visited once before. So what elements does it have? What kind of feelings did you feel when you were there? What was the environment like? And how do the elements in that space compare to the ones that were mentioned today? And if there are any different ones, what were there? There is no definitive guide on how to design an outdoor safe space on college campus. However, if we begin to consider what a safe space looks like individually for each of us, we can begin the conversation and hopefully inspire designers of the future to build campus landscapes that make everyone feel protected, safe, and secure. Thank you.
Thank you,
And
Andre,
additionally,
for that contribution. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I put my information is at the end of the slide, so if there's any questions or anything that are not addressed here, that's all available at the end too.
And we'll definitely come back to you, Andre, because I'm pretty sure we'll have some questions for you. So we thank you for your contribution. I'm going to turn it over to David. David, now that we've heard some ideas from Andre about how physical and outdoor spaces can be considered the idea of safe and connected to that, what are some thoughts you have with regard to emotional safe spaces for students on college campuses, especially those who might be underrepresented on their campuses or feeling marginalized? We would appreciate your thoughts on this topic. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely, and thank you, Sophia and Kyle, for the invitation, and thank you for providing the space for these type of dialogue, because I think it's very critical as we think about our students and their overall success, which safe spaces contributed to that. I think as someone that's worked in cultural centers and multicultural departments on various college campuses across the country, the idea of having these emotional quote unquote safe spaces are very critical in the sense that it provides a safe haven for students that are underrepresented on college campuses, and it allows them to be in community with one another, to process, to be able to engage in a way that provides familiarity and a sense of community that is not necessarily visible and recognized on other parts of a college campus. And so cultural centers are definitely spaces that provide that. And I'm going to spend some time this afternoon really talking about why cultural centers are significant in providing emotional safe spaces on college campuses. And so when you think about cultural centers, what I'm going to spend the bulk of my time talking about is that cultural centers matter, really understanding their role in supporting student emotional health and well-being, and really providing a context in terms of how we engage cultural centers more in assuring our students are successful through their own emotional wellness practices and our role in that. And so my intentions for this segment of the presentation is several reasons. One is to understand the significance of cultural centers. Two is to help us move from the conversations of thinking about safe spaces to brave spaces, and I'm going to talk more about what that looks like. Thirdly, I want to be able to build our capacity to create an emotional wellness agenda for cultural centers. Fourthly, I think it's important that I share some strategies for equity-minded cultural center practices that you will be able to take with you as you think about your work moving forward. And then last, identify next steps for self-accountability to ensure positive cultural center engagement. And so we recognize that the information that's shared today is really foundational information that we encourage everyone to take accountability to ensure that they are moving forward to improve their practice and improve the overall campus culture environment. So when you think about cultural centers, I want to be able to give this historical context because I think it's important to think about how cultural centers are significant on a college campus and how they really came about. And so when you think about the establishment of cultural centers, they really are the result of the civil rights era, right? The civil rights movement and the inequalities Black students in particular encountered on historically white campuses. They gave students a voice. Many students, particularly students of color, did not necessarily feel as if they had a voice on college campuses in the late 1960s. And so cultural centers were that place for students to find that voice on campus and to feel as if their voice was safe and could be heard. It was a response to civil and political unrest and inequities, both within our country, but also on college campuses. It was a space for social and political protests on campus, a space where students of color could come together, build community, study together, and form a unified bond in the midst of injustice and constantly hostile environments. And so I think, these type of communities were critical to student success and also their emotional well-being as far back as the 1960s. Then lastly, the establishment of cultural centers was really critical because students of color were able to feel prideful of their identity and be able to come together in solidarity. And if you think about the establishment of cultural centers, which took place in the late 1960s, these ideas and the significance of cultural centers is still relevant today, which is why in 2020, cultural centers still matter and still important to today's college campuses. And then you have various types of cultural centers. Here's a list of some of the cultural centers that exist on college campuses, but this is definitely not exhaustive, and I'm sure there's others as well. But some of the more mainstream cultural centers you see are Black cultural centers, Latinx cultural centers, LGBT cultural centers, Asian American cultural centers, Native American cultural centers, and multicultural centers. These are all, identity-based cultural centers that allow students that identify with these identities to feel at home, to feel a sense of belonging, and to feel that sense of community and pride so that they can navigate whatever wellness challenges and difficulties they may be having during their college career. It's also an opportunity for colleges and universities to heighten their awareness and broaden their understanding of these different identity groups. And so these cultural centers are not just for the folks that identify with these identities, but also for the broader community so that they can develop their own competency and knowledge and awareness of the different identities that exist within their campus. And why are cultural centers relevant today? The emotional support, the shared beliefs and values, mentoring relationships. Mentoring relationships really contribute to someone's emotional well-being when they're able to connect with people and process and talk through certain challenges and feel as if they have that confidant in their life. Many of our students may not necessarily have that support outside of the college environment, so being able to provide that for them is definitely contributes to their emotional well-being. The sense of belonging, and then also access and equity, and thinking about how cultural centers close that opportunity gap and provide more access and opportunity for our students to be successful in and out of the classroom. And so when we think about, the historical context of cultural centers, and we really think about its purpose in providing that safe space, I want to make sure that, we think about safe spaces as a foundation. We think about it as the initial step towards creating a more inclusive environment. But it's at the end of the day, it's not the final destination in terms of how we can create spaces for students of color and students from marginalized identities. What we really want to think about is how we move that conversation from just safe spaces to brave spaces, and why we want to do so. And so I'm going to give you some thoughts around that I think will help make meaning as to what we're trying to convey here. And so safe spaces, when you think about it, safe spaces can sometimes have that feeling of it being temporary. And it being a space where the feeling is what the students are experiencing may not be something that they is sustained. It's confined to a dedicated space, and so the cultural center is a safe space, right? But outside the cultural center, when they're walking across campus or they're going in various other areas across the university, that space may not feel as safe as the cultural center. So it's confined to a dedicated space. It could be perceived as a toxic environment. And why can it be perceived as a toxic environment is basically the sense that students that are in the space, they're reminded that, okay, this space is this experience is confined to this particular space. And once I leave this space, I recognize that it's not as going to feel as safe. And so that trauma is certainly a reminder that is constantly ingrained in their head and their thinking. And as a result, it can build up some toxic feelings and disrupt the environment overall. And then what self can someone bring to be accepted? And so being able to think about, okay, is this space safe enough for me to bring my whole self, bring my whole identity to the community that I'm trying to be a part of. And whereas brave spaces are really, thinking about how we move to, hold on one second, I apologize for that. Okay. Brave spaces really helps us to move to a space that is supportive, that is affirming, that is authentic, that is inclusive, right? And all these things kind of take safe spaces to the next level and really create a more substantive experience for students of marginalized identities. And so that supportive, affirming, and authentic feeling is something that is embedded and integrated into really the fabric of the culture of the organization of the university. And it's not just necessarily confined to one particular place. It is something that is really accented throughout the mission and the vision of the organization. It's inclusive. It provides emotional and mental wellness support systems. It's culturally responsive to bias incidents and other forms of inequities. And it's acceptance of the full self. I think this is something that's definitely critical in terms of thinking about, how can a student show up in their truth and be able to be their authentic self in this space of feeling brave and confident and comfortable in their own skin. So as you're thinking about safe spaces, think about how you might be able to expand that thought so that you can really create a more brave space within that safe space that has been the foundation of your work. What I think is important is that we all take focus and be intentional about building our capacity to create an emotional wellness agenda for cultural centers. So if you have cultural centers on your campus, it's important to, one, develop partnerships and collaborate with counseling services. When I served as director of the Paul Robeson Cultural Center at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, one of the things we did was we partnered with our counseling center to have community-based counselors embedded in each of the cultural centers, and all 4 cultural centers work collaboratively to make that effort possible with the counseling center. And so it was reaffirming for our students to be able to have counseling staff at our cultural centers to be able to meet with them, and the students didn't necessarily have to go to the counseling center, so the services came to them. And these individuals, these community-based counselors, were able to racially identify with our students, which was a nice complement to this initiative. Create a healing space initiative for student support. One of the things that I also did in my role at the Paul Robeson Cultural Center was create a healing space for race-like students to be able to engage and have conversations about racial injustice in society, racial injustice on campus, and how we can better support each other. This healing space was helpful for processing, was helpful for us to be able to engage and have some really deep and meaningful dialogue. Identify ways to engage in mentoring efforts to deepen relationships among students. We know that mentoring really helps contribute to student success. It also contributes to students' well-being and emotional wellness. So the more you can have initiatives around mentoring and support and cultivating those relationships for students, the better off our students will be. That is very critical to this work. Integrate emotional wellness priorities as part of your strategic plan. And so if your university has a strategic plan or your division that you work under, think about how emotional wellness is a priority and really investing in that and making sure you as a staff are role modeling some of these priorities so that students can see how you fit this into your lifestyle as well, because it's very critical that we role model for our students. And do your own work to understand what students who occupy cultural centers need. I think it's very important. A lot of times we'll go into a particular issue or a particular challenge and try to create opportunity for our students without asking our students exactly what they need. And so it's important to really hold these focus groups or hold these opportunities to students to share their experience and listen to them and take their advice and take their thoughts on how you might be able to create change that aligns with what they particularly need. Engage in informal wellness check-in conversations with students to maintain a pulse of your cultural center community. And so I think cultivating that relationship with students is so key, so that you can be able to just be able to have these informal wellness check-ins without it being seen as a structured experience for the student. It shows a sign of compassion, a sign of care, and a sign of genuineness that our students deserve to have and deserve to receive as they navigate the college experience. So let me just give you some strategies as we think through this even more. Create spaces for dialogue that are spaces for healing, processing, and community. Listen and validate the stories of others who experience injustice and are victims of inequities. Engage in active allyship and understanding, addressing, and dismantling bias. So we have to do our own work to really make sure that we're fully aware and conscious of what our students are experiencing. reframe the narrative of historically disenfranchised groups. And so I think about, a lot of times we speak about students of color or students from other marginalized identities from a deficit model. And I think it's time that we change that language and we really think about the promise and opportunity that each of these populations bring to our campus. I think we need to work towards liberation for everyone. So when we think about, inclusion, we think about equity, we think about access, we think about how can everyone feel liberated and comfortable enough in their own skin so that they can achieve their greatest potential and grow and succeed in and out of the classroom and have that emotional wellness that allows them to be feeling healed and feeling reaffirmed in their own development. Identify inclusive programming and initiatives that foster brave spaces over safe spaces. And so thinking about how you can work with your other campus partners to expand your programming that takes the idea of brave spaces to the next level for your campus environment. Integrate cultural center engagement beyond the cultural center environment. And so it's not just the cultural center's responsibility to think about student emotional wellness for particularly students of color, students from other marginalized identities. It's the entire institution's responsibility to think about how we can collectively come together to ensure our students' well-being is maintained and sustained over time. And so thinking about, who are the campus partners that can help facilitate this experience for you to make sure our students get the most they need out of their college experience. And so just some next steps before we go into the Q&A portion. I think it's important that we hold ourselves accountable to what we've talked about today and how we move forward. And so your role in cultivating brave spaces at cultural centers and beyond, I want you to think about both presentations and both conversations and identify what takeaways will you employ as you move from safe spaces to brave spaces and expanding your thoughtfulness and intentionality around this concept. How will you hold yourself and hold others accountable? And how will you, and what can you do to sustain brave spaces within your organization at your university? These are the three questions that I think you really should strongly consider as you take away meaningful concepts and ideas that were discussed here this afternoon and really do the work that our students need us to do so that they can be successful and be able to navigate some of the emotional wellness challenges they experience on campus and beyond.
Thank you so much for that. We really appreciate both your contributions to the idea of safe space, whether it's physical, outdoor, emotional, and all things in between. So one quick reminder, I just sent this out to the chat. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat, or you can raise your hand and we will unmute you so that you're able to ask your question out loud and live. So I do have a question that I want to start with, and this one is for Andre. What are some ideas you have for how campuses who may have an opportunity to either reconfigure a space or build new spaces, what are some ideas you have for them of some basic things they can do based on what you shared today? That what's non-negotiable? You must have these elements, or these are the things to think about as you consider safety for students and space that can affirm them emotionally.
Right. Well, I think that, the thing about safe spaces and about, the feeling of safety in of itself is that it's different for everybody, and I think that the one thing that campuses must do and they must have is an inventory and a good sense of what their students need, because that depends based on the geographical, political, religious, and cultural context of, where the campus is located. For a space on campus that they might seem to be healing for their students might not be the same as how it would work on a different campus. So I think the most important thing is that we look at who the population is that we're serving ultimately, and what are your needs, and if there's opportunities to have an expansive catalog and saying some students prefer to have a smaller space where there's not many people around and they can be by themselves and have a space that's quiet, versus some students who might want to be not in their own head and be around other people, and that it might call for a larger area and more green space and people to be more flexible with seating options and so that they can move around and talk to each other. I think that's something that you have to know and you have to have a good sense of before you can, really dive into creating those spaces. And again, having not only a one-size-fits-all, but having different variations of physical space experience within your college landscape.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So I see a question came in, and I'm thinking, David, this one is directed to you. Can you
Okay.
speak to any successful partnerships you've engaged in around emotional wellness with your health promotion, health education, or wellness staff other than counselors?
That's a good question. A lot of our work has been focusing on the counseling piece in terms of what I've been able to provide in the previous roles that I've served. We've certainly been, advocates and heavily involved in the health wellness arena, health services, to support programs that they're having. I think one of the things that I can reflect on is being able to engage health services in the cultural centers. So bringing the cultural center, the health services programs to the cultural centers. What I found in my roles at cultural centers is that the more I can bring the resources to the center, the more engaged our students will be in the conversation around the topic that's being discussed, and the more confident they'll be in asking the questions and getting the right resources that they need to navigate those particular areas. And so there were certainly opportunities where I was able to bring health services programming efforts to the cultural centers, and that proved to be an effective strategy to engage our students in those arenas. So I would encourage you to think about how you can partner with campus stakeholders in a way that brings those stakeholders to the cultural center, as opposed to having the students go to those spaces.
I think that's a really good point. So I have another question that I believe is directed at Andre. How can an institution integrate natural elements into scientific/medical spaces that have strict codes? Do small interventions like houseplants or fountains do anything?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are actually studies that were conducted in hospitals that stated that patients who had views from their windows of just any sort of natural plants or elements or anything facing outside, they're more likely to heal faster than patients who were only looking at like a brick wall or only looking at the inside of a building. So one way that you can kind of mitigate having access to the landscape or natural elements without actually, putting in like a park or something is facing views towards the outside and kind of bringing in that view inside and kind of having that connection there, because it's not always the case that you can, make therapeutic gardens and areas on campus where there are, actual physical interventions within the campus environment, because hospital codes and everything like that are mentioned can be very strict, and there can be a lot of hoops to jump through. But even it is just like the sound of water running can also be very therapeutic and have the same effect as hearing it outside as well. So kind of thinking about how you can integrate areas outside but also inside.
Great, thank you so much. Do we have, I'm looking to see if there are any hands raised, so I will take a quick look.
Great, and while Sophia is looking at those hands raised, I'm going to go ahead and move to a similar question about, Andre, can you speak to how you would draw students into outdoor spaces during cold weather months, considering both comfort, it being too cold, and safety, such as the fact that there's less light during the winter months?
Exactly. So that's kind of one area in the research that is pretty not very well looked at, because, like you said, people are less likely to be outside, obviously, during cold winter months. But there are some instances where you can provide, certain areas like how, for example, like zoo lights or something like that, where you are drawing in people to spaces outside for a limited amount of time, and having an area where you can engage in an activity outside that brings students in. But as far as a model of having, somebody who's feeling feelings of anxiety and needs to just be outside of their head and outside of the building per se. But in the winter, that is an issue of thinking, well, I can't really go outside because it's too cold. So that's something that would need more research and looking into.
Great, thank you. So I have a question for David. What are your thoughts about critics of cultural centers who believe that these dedicated spaces might be more divisive and unsafe for students who may hold majority identities? Are there any ways to explain the need, which I think you already did, but what are some ways that you have been able to answer these questions for folks?
Right. I think when you think about college campuses, historically speaking, particularly predominantly white institutions were not created for students of color. We're not created for women. We're not created for members of the LGBT community. I mean, these historically speaking, colleges and universities were created for majority identity populations. And so, with the diversification of our college environments today, we need to think about how we create inclusive spaces, and sometimes those inclusive spaces require us to think about race-like spaces as a space of inclusion, not to marginalize or feel as if we're segregating certain spaces, but to think about how we create spaces where race-like groups can feel that sense of community, can feel that sense of safety within a larger organization that has not always been welcoming to them, and historically speaking. And so, these are reasons why these cultural centers were initially founded, over 50 years ago, and to this day we still need them, given the context of our society and the inequities that are still present in the lives of marginalized groups of people. And so when people challenge the need for cultural centers or multicultural departments, there's really a relevancy for these departments as it relates to the ongoing and longstanding systemic structural barriers that inhibit folks to being able to be their authentic self in larger, predominantly white spaces. And so until we get to a place where we can break down those structural systemic barriers that inhibit folks to be able to achieve their full potential within the identities that they hold, we'll need to have these cultural centers as spaces for folks to affirm their identity, for folks to have that sense of community, for folks to be able to navigate the challenges of the multiple intersecting identities that might not necessarily be welcome in all spaces.
Thank you for that. And we have the next question, and I'm actually going to answer this one. And but I would definitely want to hear Andre and David your thoughts on this. Could you speak about safe, brave spaces in the area of the first office a college student would be accessing? For example, admissions office, one-stop centers where registrar or financial aid are located. These offices are often the first ones that students see. And that is very true. So my answer to this one is I would hope that all spaces on campus are safe for all students. And the only way we can do that is to be proactive and consider every point of contact that students are going to make. Every staff member is a representative of your institution. So there should be campus-wide training or at least awareness around where to refer students when they are in distress and how to identify, even going back a few steps, how to identify students in distress. And that can be done through some basic mental health training, full day trainings, or staff meeting discussions where you can bring in someone from the counseling center or other support systems nearby that can really help frame the idea of student development and what they're going through. And especially offices where there might be some bad news or difficult news shared, knowing ahead of time that you're not sure, if you're not sure what the reaction will be, having a connection to the counseling center or making sure that you have a support system close by that you can refer students to. So that's my quick answer on that. And sometimes I think we are sure to provide training for our student affairs staff and our first respondents on campus, but I think we sometimes do forget that there are administrative staff members that interact with students on a daily basis in very stressful situations that may cause students to have some really negative reactions. So I think there definitely needs to be training campus-wide, and that's part of the JED Foundation's thought process on the comprehensive approach, that there's no wrong door, that there's support systems all over your campus to make sure that students find what they need and are referred appropriately when they need it. So I don't know if Andre or David, you have anything to add to that response.
Yeah, I agree that, we should be looking at these buildings that have, students are going to more and more often than not receive, or aren't always the most welcoming or perceived as the most welcoming, because, there's a tendency to get bad news, or not, it's intended to be a place where students have difficulty, or maybe are comfortable speaking with somebody, or receiving bad news, or going through a stressful situation. And I think that, areas or spaces on campus or buildings such as, counseling centers and, these places where freshmen come in and the first financial offices and everything like that, the architectural style should really be paid attention to, because it's proven that, different there's different psychological effects of buildings on people's mental health, and having an area, again, that, going back to the whole area of access to the outdoors, having a financial office building that doesn't have barely any windows and any natural light, and not many areas of nice landscaping around, or areas where people can walk around and relax, that might not be the most inviting design, and in turn might not have the most inviting feel to whoever's using it, which in turn creates levels of anxiety, which is what we don't want to have. So focusing on areas that students would be using and not always having or you can anticipate not them always having a positive reaction to, or experience, and should be focused on in to that sense.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. David, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just also add that for those, these offices like the registers, financial aid, and various other spaces that our students will go to first, it's important that the staff in those offices are doing their own work to make sure they're able to meet the students where they are in terms of their needs and services that they have to provide, particularly our students of color and students from other marginalized identity groups. So when I say that, what I mean is that what is the institution doing, or what are those departments doing to include training and development opportunities for folks to be able to develop their cultural competency and identity consciousness, so that they are able to strengthen their knowledge, skills, and awareness around identity and inclusion, and be able to be equipped with the right skills to meet our students where they are. So when our students come to ask questions around their financial aid, or around class assignment, class registration, and there are some complex identities that might intersect with the question, our staff should have the skill sets to be able to respond based on some training and ongoing development, professional development that they are engaging in to strengthen their competency in that area. And so I think the institution has to take responsibility, and departments need to take responsibility to do their own work to better serve our students.
Thank you so much. And that's a great note to end on. I want to thank you both, to Andre Banerjee and Dr. David Jones, for your participation. And I'm turning it over to Kyle to conclude our session for today. Thanks to all who participated.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sophia. And as she mentioned, we are very grateful that you were able to join us today for this webinar. And we want this to be the beginning of conversations and ways that the JED Foundation can support you in your work in promoting emotional health and mental health on your campus. So if you have any questions for our speakers, again, their emails are below. We do have, if you download the slides, there are various sources that you can do further reading. And yeah, we are just very thankful for Andre and David for joining us today. And really, everything that we do on campus is an opportunity for us to create these these spaces for students to be able to think about their well-being, their wellness. And so we invite you to think on the questions that Andre and David posed, and get back to us at a future date. And we hope that you do join us for a future webinar. And so we hope that you will have a great rest of your Tuesday. Take care.